In 1986, I attended an international peace conference held in Montreal. One of the speakers at the conference was Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, author, recipient of that year's Nobel Peace Prize. During his talk, Wiesel referred to the biblical story of Noah and the flood, and I remember him saying, "I don't like Noah. I would have liked Noah, I would have respected Noah if Noah had refused to cooperate with God's plan, this plan of purifying the earth by flooding the earth, killing the human beings, killing all creatures except for Noah, his family, and 2 animals of each species that would be kept safe in an ark." Wiesel said that when God said to Noah, "You have found favor in my eyes, and so you will live and everyone else would die," at that point, Noah should have said, "I won't go along with that, God. I will not be complicit in the genocide of others. If you are going to kill everyone, then you kill myself and my family as well. I'll have no part of this plan." Now, as I listened, I experienced a mix of reactions. Part of me was saying, you can't talk to God that way. I mean, after all, if God says jump, aren't we supposed to ask how high? Another part of me, however, wanted to applaud someone publicly declaring that the story of the flood is not a nice God story that we should be putting as a cover illustration on children's Bibles. It is a terrifying story of God killing God's people and God's creatures. I've since come to believe that my first reaction, don't talk to God that way, is not necessarily either a biblical response or a Jewish response. And the Noah story is told in what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible or scriptures. Now, the Old Testament has a multitude of examples of people who bluntly talk to God, who call God to account, who question God, and who do not willingly accept what they've been told is God's will. If you want to see this, just browse through the book of the Psalms. Psalm 4 begins with the psalmist saying, "Answer me when I call, God. Answer me, don't ignore me." Psalm 6 begins, "God, do not rebuke me in your anger, do not discipline me in your wrath," or as we might say, "God, don't flood the world." Psalm 13, "How long, O God? How long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I experience pain? Answer me." Then there's Psalm 22, which Jesus quotes on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus himself told a parable about a widow and a judge, sometimes referred to as the parable of the persistent widow. The widow keeps coming to the judge, asking the judge to intercede, to enact justice on her behalf. And the judge consistently ignores her, and finally he gives in because he says she has worn her down with her repeated and insistent request. And Jesus, according to the writer of the Gospel of Luke, held this up as an example of how we should pray to God. Just keep on demanding justice. You can't talk to God that way, except people of faith, people who have given us our texts of faith, do speak to God that way. Do refuse to just quietly accept their lot in life. Do say, "Where are you, God? Help. This isn't right, God." Which leads me to the story we have from Mark's Gospel. The disciples in the boat in a storm, and they respond like many of the psalmists might respond. Jesus tells his disciples he wants to cross the sea. So they get into a boat, they set out, and suddenly in the midst of the sea, a great windstorm sweeps across the water. The water goes from calm to turbulent. Waves reach up from the lake's surface. They smash into the boat. The boat begins to fill with water as the waves wash over its side. The disciples don't know if they can keep the boat from sinking or capsizing. And what is Jesus doing during all this chaos? He's in the stern of the boat, lying on a cushion, sleeping. So the disciples wake him. They wake him by saying, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" I think their response falls within the tradition of the Psalms. "Wake up. Where are you? Don't ignore us. Answer us. Why have you forsaken us?" Or in this case, "Why are you sleeping while we're bailing the boat? How long will you hide your face from us, O Lord? How long do you intend to sleep while we cope with the storm, Jesus?" I think the disciples respond as many of us would respond when we're in a storm, when what seems to give our life stability is sinking, when we feel waves are crashing into us from every side, when we want to say, "Where are you, God? Wake up. Don't you even care that we are perishing, that our world seems to be sinking?" And then our story, our text becomes parable. Jesus wakes up and he rebukes the wind, criticizes the wind for misbehaving, says to the sea, peace, be still, and the wind stops and the sea calms and everything grows still. And then Jesus, who has just rebuked the wind, seems to also rebuke his friends. He says to them, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? Seems to me an appropriate answer, a faithful answer, an answer in the spirit of the psalmist that we have noted might have been to say, of course we have faith. We woke you up, didn't we? Now, there are lots of ways of approaching this story. We can say the story tells us that if Jesus is in our boat, everything will be okay. We could say that when Jesus called for peace, he wasn't so much calming the outside storm, but the inner storms of fear inside the disciples. We could say this is just an early teaching that we should keep our heads when all about us are losing theirs. Or we can hear the story as a parable about fear and faith, a parable that doesn't so much teach a concise lesson, but helps place us into the large story of God. We can hear this as a story about the storms we encounter. Our world continues to experience the storm of COVID, and even when society reopens, many will carry the trauma and the scars of being battered by waves, by economic loss, job loss, grieving those who have died, the lingering pain from the difficulty of having been physically absent from others. It can feel like we are in a storm as many of our assumptions, our norms, our practices, the way we think things and have been taught things are supposed to be are unraveling. We wake up to past injustices, to dehumanizing systems. White supremacy is unraveling. Male privilege is unraveling. Rigid definitions of human gender identity are unraveling. And religious and cultural exclusivity are unraveling. And in Canada, our understanding of our history is unraveling. The discovery of the remains of 215 children at the site of the residential school in Kamloops has shocked this country. 1 week after the discovery, the Canadian Race Relation Foundation and the Assembly of First Nations commissioned a survey of Canadians. They polled 3,000 Canadians, and 93% of the respondents said they knew little or nothing about the residential school system in this country. I never learned about residential schools in my history lessons. I learned nothing about a system designed to eliminate the language and culture of students who had been removed from their families and their communities. And if I learned anything about treaties, it was probably the colonial understanding that they were business transactions, not what I would think now might be an indigenous understanding that treaties are a way of expanding the community and inviting everyone to share in the care of the land. We have much to unlearn and much to learn. We are in need of so much healing. The boat of history that many of us have sailed in is now pummeled by waves of another story of history. We feel tossed on the sea. We wonder if we can stay afloat. In our biblical story, the disciples wake Jesus and say to him, "Don't you care that we are perishing?" And I find their words reminiscent of the words of the slaves whom Moses led from Egypt into the harsh wilderness. And there they cried out, "Moses, we're perishing. Did you lead us into this place just so we can die?" Moses led God's people into a wilderness. Jesus led his disciples onto the sea. And maybe one of the things these stories tell us is that being in a storm, being in a place of wilderness is difficult. But maybe we have to be in those places. Maybe God needs us to sometimes be in those places if we are to be transformed. If we're to let go of the certainties and the stories and the history that have shaped our beliefs and our actions, maybe we need to experience a time of loss, the time when our perceptions of the world are shaken, are perishing, times when we no longer feel we can control and manage our story. In those times, the psalmist felt that God had abandoned them. They asked God, "Why are you ignoring me? Why, God, have you deserted me?" But it seems to me that even in saying that, they somehow acknowledge that God hasn't. You don't ask God, "Why have you abandoned me?" if you think God really has abandoned you. That somehow their question acknowledged a deep trust that God is listening, that God must be listening, God must be caring, because that is who God is. God cannot abandon them. And those Psalms conclude with the psalmist finally trusting that God somehow was with them, is with them now, and will be with them in the future. Faith is not a guarantee of comfort. It's not a guarantee that life will consist only of pleasant dreams. Faith is a choice to trust that God is with us even in the times of storm and wilderness. This Gospel of Mark ends what many scholars believe is the original ending in a very strange and ambiguous way, with Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, coming to the tomb to find the body of the crucified Jesus. And there instead they find a young man dressed in white who tells them Jesus has been raised. He will go ahead of the disciples. They will see him again. But then comes the ending. Speaking of these two women, it says, and so they went out and they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In the story of the boat and the storm, Jesus asks his disciples about fear and faith. The end of this gospel speaks of faith and fear, inviting us to decide for ourselves, what do we do with an empty tomb? So for me, this boat story acknowledges that storms will come, that at times we will feel overwhelmed, that life is falling apart. For me, this boat story affirms that in the stormy times, it is an act of faith to cry out to God and to ask God to wake up and to wonder if God cares. But for me, this boat story also invites me into an experience of faith like that of the disciples, who after the storm is stilled, who at that point wonder, who is this Jesus that transforms storm to stillness? This story invites me to never stop wondering, who is Jesus? Who is this Christ who invites me into an awe of this God found in both storm and stillness? The story invites me to a faith that does not protect me from experiencing storms, but somehow grounds me into a deep, deep trust that God is present with us even in the storms. Trust that when we go through storms and wilderness, we go through them with God. Trust that no matter what, we are God's. That God is in storm and stillness, that peace comes, that even death does not stop resurrection, that fear and faith somehow dance together in the love of God, and that somehow we will be transformed into a new people, into a new history. In storm and wilderness, we are in God. God be with us now and always. Amen.